Good morning. Our message is brought to you by Carden Doors today. Appreciate Bruce and Susie and for Alan Brinker for making that happen. And Nick Hutchins is not here today. But I tell you, if you know anything about Nick, he's like a genie in a bottle. Because this week, I just kind of mentioned it Monday morning. Man, I was looking around the building. Wouldn't it be awesome to have a door for our visual aid this morning? And then the next thing I know, Tuesday morning, there's a door in the back of his truck and shows up. And he's just so wonderful and a blessing to this church, and thankful for his work with the teens and in so many other areas of our church. And thankful for them and praying for them as they travel home today, and hope they've had a great weekend at Winterfest. Our choices have consequences. We all know that. And from even our childhood, we know that to be true. And that's where we learn that our choices have consequences. And if you've been around church, if you've grown up in church, you probably have a story of learning that your choices have consequences while you were in church. Me and my wife, Cassidy, both have memories of facing consequences from our actions while we're sitting there in the pew with our parents at church. Cassidy never wanted it to appear as if she was in trouble when she was being carried out of the assembly to be disciplined. And so as she would be walking down the aisles and everyone can see, you know what's happening when a kid's being taken out of the aisle and taken into the bathroom. You know what that means. And Cassidy didn't want anyone to know that. And so as she was being disciplined, her mom or dad would be taking her out of the assembly. She would be smiling, this big old smile as she's being taken out of the auditorium, so that no one would know what was going on and that she was in trouble. And me, on the other hand, I remember distinctly, my parents are here today, so I'm going to embarrass them a little bit. And so one Sunday, I had been acting up. I don't know what I did, but I was being disciplined. And so my dad took me into the restroom and carried out the discipline. And I looked back at him. I'm saying it like, politically correct. Okay, so carrying out the discipline. And I looked back at him and I said, "That didn't even hurt." And I paid the price. Our actions have consequences. Our choices carry with them consequences. And today we're going to look at a story in which those choices that someone made carried with them consequences. In fact, the past 2 weeks, we've looked at stories with Adam and Eve, last week with Grady, and today with Cain and Abel. And it's all about how choices carry consequences. So let's look at the text today in Genesis chapter 4 as we look at the story of Cain and Abel. And where we pick up with Cain and Abel is after this story of Adam and Eve, as Ben has just read for us, as they ate of the forbidden fruit and were exiled from the garden and from the presence of God. But we pick up the story today and we see that God, even though Adam and Eve messed up, God was still with them. We look at Genesis 4, the beginning of verse 1. It says, "And Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain." And notice, as Eve celebrates this birth, that her and Adam re-partner with God. Remember, their purpose was to go be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, rule over the world, rule over creation, join with God in ruling over creation. And we see them, that they partner with him, and they produce a child. And Adam and Eve, this time, they're praising God as they've participated in the creation process. And she says, "With the Lord's help, I have produced a man." And what we see here simply is that Adam and Eve are living into their purpose. They're joining with God and they're giving glory and praise to God as they have their first child named Cain. And then later, there in verse 2, it says, "She gave birth to his brother and named him Abel." Now, Cain and Abel, they were about as different as you can imagine siblings being. And probably some of you have this experience, right? You have a sibling who you are total opposites. Like, you could not be any more different, right? We've probably had that experience before, or some of you are in that kind of sibling relationship. Well, that's kind of how it was with Cain and Abel. And it's going to kind of seem opposite as we read this verse, but let's explain. It says, "And when they grew up, Abel became a shepherd, while Cain cultivated the ground." Now, in our terms, you're thinking, actually, they sound kind of like they're exactly the same. They're both farmers, because that's kind of how we classify it. Right? Coming from Enola, Arkansas, we had a lot of cattle farmers. And so when you think of a shepherd or a rancher, you're kind of thinking in your mind of a farmer, and that's kind of what Cain did, except for he worked with the fruit of the ground. He cultivated the ground. But in ancient times, these were total opposites, right? You're total opposites at these two career choices. And as we kind of see in personality and how they relate to one another and how they relate to God, their personalities seem to be on the total opposite side of the spectrum as well. But these two lines of work, being a shepherd, some of your translations say that Abel was a keeper of the sheep. And then so that occupation, and then a cultivator of the ground, or a worker of the ground, a farmer, as we think of someone who plants seed and harvests his crop. That's what Cain did. Abel was the shepherd, keeper of the sheep. Cain was a cultivator of the ground. And in ancient times, there was almost this kind of competition between the two, as reflected in other ancient Near Eastern cultures. And as we come to see through this story, as we see this competitiveness come to light. As we read in verses 3 and 4, we read about Cain and Abel both drawing near to God with a gift, or as we might say in more religious terms, an offering, later to be revealed in the law of Moses and the other books of Exodus and so on. And so they come to God and they bring this offering, they bring this gift to him. And what we're told in the text is that Abel brings an offering from his sheep, the firstborn of his flock. He brings a fat sacrifice, the fat portions. That sounds weird to us, but that was part of the culture, part of the sacrificial system. And then you have Cain, who then brings an offering of the fruit of the ground. Perhaps that was vegetables, fruits, probably more like a grain offering. Which, by the way, when you look at the law of Moses, both were included as acceptable sacrifices for different purposes. But what we find out, kind of where the rub comes in the story, is that in verses 4 and 5, it says, "The Lord accepted Abel and his gift, but he did not accept Cain and his gift." Now, throughout time, scholars and commentators, they've debated over why did God not accept Cain's offering? What was it about Abel's offering that was so different than Cain? What was it about these gifts that both of these brothers brought that caused God to reject one and accept the other? And the fact is, we simply don't know. Now, a lot has been written on it, and in our fellowship, we have a history of talking about it and making big points for today about our worship. But the point is, we don't know. Scholars have said, is it the quality of the sacrifice, right? Was it about the quality? Was it about the content of the sacrifice? Did God want something specific, or did he want something, like we said, was it the quality? Was it the fact that Abel offered the firstborn, right? The first fruits? Was it about attitude? Was it because of what was in the heart and where that offering was coming from internally? The fact is, the text simply does not tell us enough to know. And if the text doesn't tell us enough to know, it probably tells us this: it's not the point of the story. So what is the point of the story? And I think that's revealed in the next few verses. So Cain, as we can probably imagine, is upset by the fact that God did not accept his offering. But you and me, if we were to do this, we were to give an offering to God and he weren't to accept it, we would probably also be upset, but it'd kind of be more along the lines of, we're embarrassed, we're ashamed. Kind of similar to how Adam and Eve react after they've eaten from the tree, right? They have this shame that comes upon them. And they realize their nakedness. They're now ashamed. They're disappointed. They're embarrassed by the fact that they had done what is wrong. Well, that's not exactly how Cain reacts. He doesn't just react with shame and embarrassment, but he reacts with anger. In the second part of verse 5, it says, "So Cain became extremely angry and looked annoyed and hostile." Some of your translations, I just picked the one that communicated most clearly. But some of your translations will say his face became downcast or his face fell. Okay? And so he's got this frustration, this anger. And even though that seems, we might not think we might react that way, we can probably understand being frustrated, thinking you offered something that was good, and to come to find out it didn't meet the standard. And so he begins to have this anger. Right? But it's not just a normal anger. Cain's anger apparently escalated so much so that God felt the need to come and to talk to him about it before it were to escalate too far. And in verse 6, God has this sort of father-son conversation with Cain. And it says, "And the Lord said to Cain, 'Why are you so angry? And why do you look annoyed?'" Which, by the way, this says something big about God. We learn something about God in this story. Because some of us come to the text with this image of God from the fire and brimstone preaching that we may have heard growing up. And we've got this image of God is that when you fail, when you mess up, when you fail to offer him what he wants, he's angry and you're in danger of condemnation. And it's almost like he's just waiting for you to make the wrong move. But that's not the image of God that we have here. It's not the picture that Genesis paints. Moses, the writer, paints for us. But instead, as Cain, he offered the wrong thing, what does God do? He comes beside him, has this kind of father-son conversation. He says, "Listen, Cain, you're at a crossroads at this point. You're at an intersection where, you didn't offer me, or I didn't accept your sacrifice, but listen, it's no problem. Okay, God showers Cain with his grace and says, but you've got a choice to make. You can choose to do well, right? He says, if you do what is right, won't you be accepted? Right? It's not that big a deal. Just correct, do what is right. Repent, do what is right. That's all you've got to do. God's offering his grace to Cain. But then he tells him, but if you don't, if you allow this to escalate, he says, if you do not do what is right, if you don't make a change, you don't make a pivot at this point in your life, sin is crouching at your door, and it desires to have you, but you must rule over it. So God paints this picture of as that Cain is on one side of this door, and sin is kind of pictured in kind of terms that were familiar to the ancients of this time, of this kind of like demon beast-like figure. He personifies sin. We can't see it, but it's the language used in the Hebrew, that it depicts this kind of language of this beast on the other side of the door, just waiting for you to open it so it can rush through and overtake you. And so what God is saying is that sin is at your door. It's knocking. It's waiting for you to answer. And when it does, and you open that door, it's going to rule over you. It's going to master you. It's going to subdue you, which, by the way, is all the type of language that we looked at in the creation account, as God creates humanity in his image to do what? To rule over creation with him, to partner with God and to rule, to dominate creation. But here we see a reversal, is that God says that sin's on the other side of that door, and it's going to rule over you if you allow it to. That's the crossroads. The intersection that Cain finds himself. It says, it desires to have you. Other translation, to master you, to dominate you, to subdue you. But you must rule over it. Well, why? Because that's what you were created to do as an image bearer of God. You have the ability, with the partnership with God, to overtake this temptation, to overcome this choice to do wrong, to allow anger, in his case, anger to escalate to a point of making a poor choice. And so you think, you walk away from this conversation with God, how different is this from the story of Adam and Eve, where Adam and Eve had to be talked into committing the sin, right? The serpent deceives them and talks them into something. But in this case, God is doing everything he can to talk Cain out of allowing this situation to escalate. But you would hope Cain would do the right thing here. And it appears maybe that's what he's doing at the first part of verse 8. It says, now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. You think, oh, they're going to go out there, they're going to work this out like brothers. And sin, at this point, is knocking on Cain's door. What decision will he make? And we continue on reading. It says, and while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel, and he killed him. And so Cain answered the door, allowed the beast in, allowed sin in, and it ruled over him and caused him to make a choice that would drastically change the course of his life and the dynamic of his family, and the destiny of human history forever. As you have this first account of death. You remember back in the garden, this is what God was talking about. He told them, do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because when you do so, you will surely die. And the serpent comes to Adam and Eve, knocks on their door, and comes to Eve and says, you will not surely die. Totally denied exactly what God had said. Eve said, we can't eat of the tree, we'll die. The serpent says, no, you will not surely die. And they believed him. They bought the lie. And they ate of the fruit. And as we saw last week, they didn't die, at least tangibly. And so kind of eat the fruit. Yes, there's consequences with it. Yes, there was a curse alongside of it. But you could walk away from that story saying, wasn't the serpent kind of right? Right? They didn't die. They didn't drop dead when they ate of that fruit. They lived to walk another day. Yet on this day, as Cain found himself in that very same situation and sin knocked on the door, he opened the door and allowed it to rule over him. Adam and Eve found out what God meant when he said, you shall surely die. As their own offspring, their own creation with partnership with God had now died at the hand of their other son. As that they experienced death firsthand in a family. And if you've experienced death prematurely with the child or something like that, you know the pain that might go along with this. Is to experience death in your family in such a tragic way. And especially from a hand of one brother to the other. It's truly tragic this story is. But what it tells us is this, is that yes, sin does have the consequences God says that it has. It produces death. Now, when Adam and Eve, after they had sinned, they allowed sin in, they allowed it to rule over them, and God came to them, and questioned them about it. And they kind of beat around the bush, if you'll remember from last week, right? They beat around the bush, but they ultimately kind of speak to what has happened, even though they kind of pass the blame a little bit, but they ultimately take responsibility. Not so with Cain. God comes to Cain just like he did with his parents. He says, the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? And Cain takes no responsibility here. He says the exact opposite of taking responsibility. He says, I don't know, he replied. Am I my brother's keeper? And what's interesting about that phrase, am I my brother's keepers? Remember, Abel was what? He was a shepherd, or some of your translations make this connection. He was a keeper of the sheep. And so here, Cain, instead of showing some sort of remorse, instead of showing some shame, in contrast to his parents who did show shame from their sin, Cain shows no shame. And in fact, he's sarcastic, he's rude. As he says, am I the keeper's keeper? Could the keeper not protect himself? The keeper, the one who was supposed to protect the flock, could the keeper not protect himself? He said, am I the shepherd's shepherd? Am I responsible for him? And what we see is that God calls him out. And he says, what? He says, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. And for the sake of time, we're not going to go through the rest of the story here. But what I want us to see from this point forward is that Cain deals with the consequences of allowing sin to rule over him. And what we see here then is that God exiles him, or God gives him this curse where the ground won't produce any fruit. And of course, that's his occupation, that's his purpose as a cultivator of the ground. And he then becomes a wanderer of the earth. But what we see even in this curse of Cain, as you go through, that's not really our point this morning, but if you were to look through the rest of the passage there and what you see is this, and what I really want us to understand is that God continues to provide for Cain, even after Cain allows sin to rule over him. Even after Cain refuses every attempt of God to show him grace, God continues to provide for him. You'll see God provides him protection. God provides him blessing as he goes and establishes a city. But what we see most of all in this text, and we're going to skip down to verse 16 here, is that the result of Cain's sin is that he goes away from the presence of the Lord. It says, and Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. You say, where's Nod? Where's that on the map? It doesn't really matter because that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is that now he's further east of Eden. Is that the result of allowing sin to dominate him, to subdue him, there's more gap between God and man. And that's really the story of Genesis. As you start out in the garden, you see humanity as they continue to make poor choices, continue to allow sin to dominate. They get further and further and further and further from the presence of God and further from the Garden of Eden, the place that symbolizes man, humanity's, and God's relationship. So he goes further east of Eden. And the story of Genesis, it continues to spiral to the point that we're going to see next week and looking at Genesis 6 with the flood. But what we see from this story and what we want to draw upon for just a moment is that, remember, although we see humanity spiraling at this point, sins progressing from eating a forbidden fruit to killing your own brother, right? That's a pretty dark space. But what we see in Genesis is that this was not the way it was meant to be. Yes, that's true. If you turn on the news, you might still see these realities today. And we have all been affected by the realities of death in our own lives and tragic choices that are made in these similar experiences. But it was not meant to be this way. Taking us back to the point of our first lesson in this series in creation is that we were created in the image of God to rule over the creation of God. And what that sentence really means is not about, oh, we're kings and queens and we get to dominate others. That's not the point. The point is that you were created to be in relationship and partnership to the Creator. That you were meant to be a part of His purposes for the world. But the reality is, and the problem is, sin is knocking at the door. Yes, we were created with this great purpose to thrive with God, to be in relationship with Him. But the problem is, there's this other force drawing us away from the presence of God, and it's knocking at the door. And the reality is, when we open up that door and allow sin to dominate us, it impacts our relationships. It impacts our relationship with God and with others. And I know what we're thinking here is, or maybe you're thinking this, is, well, there's some sins, right, that it doesn't hurt other people. Right? We're not quite like Cain. We didn't sin as bad as Cain. Our sin doesn't affect other people. So why does God care what choices we make? And I want to say this. I think that that's a total illusion. If we think that our sin does not affect our relationship with others, or that there's certain sins, things, and we define sin as that which is against God's standards, that's which is against His intentions for good and blessed living on this earth. If that's how we define sin, we say, well, there's certain things, right, that I might do or I might do behind closed doors that it doesn't really affect anyone else. But that's an illusion. Is that sin always has a cost either in a relationship with God or a relationship with others. We see this in that story of Adam and Eve. All right? It's very clearly illustrated. You'd say, what about the forbidden fruit? How did that affect anybody else? It didn't hurt anyone else. It didn't harm anyone else. What was wrong with that? But the reality is, it did. You see Adam and Eve's relationship change very quickly after they committed that sin. There's this shame brought into the relationship, and there's some deterioration, some decay that takes place in their marriage. You see as it goes forward in their family that this cycle of disobedience and pattern of rebellion follows them to the next generation. And their kids learn from them, and now one of their sons is dead. Is that there's no sin that is harmless. There's no sin that doesn't have consequences. There's no sin so small that it doesn't harm our relationships with God or with other people. And the first thing sin does is that it distorts the image of God in us. As we give ourselves to a different purpose, that has an impact to us. God created us for a specific purpose, to partner with Him to bring blessedness and goodness to the world. And when we sin, we ultimately are rejecting that purpose that God has for us, no matter the nature of the sin. And that takes a toll on our soul. It takes a toll on who we are on the inside and how we relate to God. And it takes a toll on how we represent ourselves as human beings, as image bearers of God. And whether that deteriorates our peace, it causes mental health issues, it causes physical issues, whatever it is. And I'm not saying that God punishes us by bringing those upon us. But what I'm saying is this, is when we reject our purpose, we live without peace, we live without security. We're not living into the reason that we were created, and that takes a natural toll on us. Is that our choices, just like we learned as a little kid, just as I and Cassidy learned as a little kid, that our choices have consequences and has a cumulative effect on our life. And then the other thing is this, is not only does sin distort the image of God in us, how we view ourselves and our relationship with God, but it blinds us from seeing the image of God in others. And we hinted at this in the first lesson. But we see this so clearly in the story of Cain and Abel. Right? Cain had messed up. He rejected God's purpose for him. He allows his anger to accumulate to the point in which he is blinded by his anger and by his sin to where he's unable to recognize the image of God in his brother Abel, and does the unthinkable and murders his own brother. And you think, no, that's not going to affect me in that way. Yes, I sin, but I don't hurt other people. I make sure whatever the things that I do, the things behind closed doors, it doesn't affect anyone else. But the reality is, when we give ourselves over to sin, even in small ways that we think don't affect other people, the reality is all of it's going to come out in the wash, right? Is what we do behind closed doors forms who we are on the outside. It forms who we are to other people. And even though we might think that these little choices made here and there, it doesn't affect how I treat others. The reality is, if we're honest with ourselves, it does. We become people who aren't kind. We become people who hurt others with our words, however unintentionally that might be. We verbally harm others. We mistreat others. We don't have patience with other people. You see, sin that happens on the inside, even things that happen behind the closed doors in relationship to sin, it affects us. And if we're honest with ourselves, we've all sinned in that way. We all harm other people even in the smallest of ways, or what we might consider small ways. But it impacts our relationship. I read one commentator say this, is no matter how good our relationships are on this earth, you might say no matter how healthy, no matter how good they are not what they could be because of sin. That sin limits even the best of relationships, and it harms even the best of relationships. And that's because of one last point here, is that sin always leads to death, period. And that's the reality we experience on this earth, is that sin leads to death. Sin knocks on the door. And when we open the door and allow sin in, the result is death every time in some way or form, sometimes more tangible than others. But the reality is it brings death. Sin brings death to our friendships. It brings death to our relationships. It brings death to our marriages. It brings death to our cities. And brings death into our churches. Is that the reality of sin truly does affect our relationships with God and with other people. And as God said, you will surely die. And so here's what I want us to walk away with today. The story of Cain and Abel is this, I believe, is that we are called to rule over sin rather than to be ruled by sin. Now, before we kind of go away with this kind of legalistic understanding of you need to pick yourself up by your bootstraps and just do what is right, that's not what we're advocating here for. But if you look throughout the entire story, God is right there with Cain, saying, no, don't do this. He's partnering with Cain, saying, Cain, there's a better way. And with God's help, we can overcome those things. In fact, God came himself. He came as a human being. He put himself up on the cross to eliminate the power of sin, to put death to death, to put death to sin, in bringing life to all people who will put their faith in him. Jesus of Nazareth has given us the power, the dominion, as Paul would say in Romans 6, that we can have dominion over sin as we partner with him, become his follower, and allow ourselves to be transformed by his reviving spirit. And that's the gospel, is that the hope of the gospel and the hope of Genesis is, yes, even when sin does knock on the door and we open it up and we get ruled over sin, that the same God who spoke the worlds into existence, as we see in Genesis 1, that same God, by that same power, can free you from the grip of sin. He says, yes, sin can rule over you, but through the power of God and through the relationship, partnership with Jesus and the power of the Spirit, we receive God's grace and we can be released from that grip of sin on our soul. I'm going to look at two more passages in Genesis as we wrap this up. At the end of Genesis chapter 4, where it seems like there's no hope in this story, and Adam and Eve are broken from the loss of one of their children. It says, Adam made love to his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth. And notice, as they're broken by sin, they're beaten down by the loss and the tragedy that has stricken their family. They've experienced death, as God had said in the garden. They experienced death firsthand for the first time. Eve is still able, in her partnership with God, to lift up the name of the Lord. And she says this, after all of this has happened, Seth also had a son, he named him Enosh, and at that time, we lost it. Okay, she says, God has granted me another child in the place of Abel, since Cain killed him. But what we see there, as tragic as this is, and maybe that's still like a bleak passage to read, but what we see is that Adam and Eve, through all this pain and death, they continue to entrust themselves to God, and God continues to bless them. Yes, there's brokenness, but the story is still filled with blessedness and with promise. And what we also read in verse 26, that at that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. As sin brought people to their knees, they experienced death for the first time and the tragedy of death. It caused people to turn to the Lord and to call on His name. Because as He has been the entire time, He's been with them, open to humanity, reaching His hand out to partner with us in order to rule over creation and rule over sin. And so this morning, we have all heard sin's knock. Sin has knocked on our door. And the story of humanity is that each one of us has opened up that door and allowed sin to enter our lives and has taken hold of us. Now, some of us in this room have turned over to Jesus and said, Jesus, I want you to take the reins. I want you to take dominion of my life, control, and to release me from the power of sin. And we've done that when we put our faith in Jesus, repent, forsake those things, and are baptized. But that's what happens, that sin no longer has dominion over us as we receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. But some of us in this room are still under that grip of Satan. But what we learn is that even when we choose evil, even when we open the door to sin, God still is working for our good. And that can be your story this morning. In just a moment, Zach is going to come back up, and we're going to sing a song about lifting up the name of the Lord. And that's where we left Eve in this story, is despite all the brokenness, despite the pain, despite the control sin had taken of their lives, she was still able to lift up the name of the Lord because He was with them each step of the way, partnering with them, helping them, blessing them, and giving them promise. If you're here this morning, you'd like to make a step of faith and call on the name of the Lord, we invite you to come and do that now as we sing and lift up His name on high.
Lord, I lift your name on high.